Let me ask you something. Do you believe social media pushes extremist content and misinformation to such an extent that it impacts our well-being and democracy? If so, I invite you to evaluate why we believe this. Because there is a possibility we take arguments about the dangers of social media misinformation for granted just because, well, they make so much sense. I mean, what are we supposed to think? Look at our polarized political landscape and pandemic, for Christ's sake. We've experienced powerful countries leaving the European Union because supposed stupidity. We've also experienced deaths because of vaccine misinformation, and we read about Russian users influencing elections in different parts of the world. These events alone should convince anyone and their mothers about the potential harms of social media, right? Still, what if the links between misinformation on social media and its effect on society are mostly unsupported? What if we've been repeating unsupported beliefs as mantras, when in reality, they are based on our confirmation biases and fallacies? That's something Serrano-Alarcón and colleagues decided to discuss in a recent perspective in the scientific journal Nature. They investigated the validity of the most common misperceptions and arguments about social media misinformation and its supposed harmful effects. We see that these claims, which are often made broadly by intellectuals and journalists in the media, frequently lack empirical support. And you probably heard or read variations of them. We're increasingly exposed to high volumes of false and extremist content on social media. Users consume false and extreme content primarily because of social media algorithms rather than intentionally. False and extreme content on social media platforms causes undesirable thinking and behaviors. And although these claims seem plausible, we should consider the supporting evidence behind them. This type of honest examination is crucial since the arguments affect our approach to free speech, online regulation, and censorship. Especially since 2016, we've faced repeated warnings about the growing exposure to false and extreme information on social media. We've seen staggering statistics about the number of views associated with extreme or false content. But a closer look into the statistics revealed that the reported figures often lack context. They miss the bigger pictures of the vast volumes of content on social media platforms. Remember Facebook's alarming reports about the 2016 US presidential elections? They revealed that content distributed by Russian trolls allegedly reached 126 million US citizens before the election. But Budak and colleagues point out that the troll content represented only 0.004% of the content that US citizens saw in their news feeds. They write, "We acknowledge that these figures are huge in absolute terms, but in context, we believe that their effects are likely to be small given that they represent a tiny proportion of total information flows on the platform." We can see this in the context of adherence to news. Previous research have highlighted that content requires prolonged and repeated exposure to have even brief media effects. And those brief media effects are then also diluted by our access to competing sources of information and the fact that we can opt out of news. So then, what is the actual effect of social media misinformation? Another misconception involves the algorithms of social media platforms. We're often told that filter bubbles or information bubbles trap users and that they expose them to inflammatory content. Still, in reality, we don't have much evidence of the algorithm's impact on beliefs and behaviors. In fact, it seems that instead of the algorithm dictating our news consumption, our content diet represents our existing preferences. In other words, people who consume deviating content often look for it specifically. Keep in mind that these findings don't neglect the direct or indirect impact of algorithms on our beliefs and behaviors. They might well affect us, but that particular evidence isn't clear, and as a result, the narrative connecting algorithms with the harmful impact of social media misinformation seems exaggerated. And while the news seemingly inflates the ability of social media algorithms to shape us, they seem to downplay our active demands for specific information. With all this in mind, we can ask ourselves if people's preferences for more extreme and unreliable content may derive from general dissatisfaction or distrust rather than social media effects. Putting it differently, are arguments linking social media content and extreme behaviors correlational or causational? And if it is causational, what causes what? Let's have a look at that. The effect of social media on polarized or polarizing ideas and behaviors may seem self-evident. For example, we see that increased social media use coincides with polarizing or extreme views and an increased distrust towards social structures and institutions such as governments and media. But Budak and colleagues point out that although social media use and polarization correlate, news and media have often overemphasized and misdirected their causal relationship. For example, one study suggests that reduced social media use, for example Facebook, has little to no effect on so-called affective polarization, which is another word for tribalistic feelings towards specific groups. In fact, data seem to suggest the opposite causal relationship. Affective polarization predicts social media behaviors. Even though anti-establishment movements or anti-vaccine advocates use social media platforms to coordinate and spread information, the causal relationship is, at best, unclear. Simply speaking, the evidence does not strongly support broad statements about social media's influence on social unrest, polarization, or general knowledge. It's more, the authors of the Nature Perspective paper acknowledges that. They acknowledge that such a study would require researchers to systematically limit or vary access to social media and evaluate the outcomes reliably. In other words, we simply don't know how or that social media significantly affects our behaviors, for example, towards society. Speaking of bold statements, a hasty generalization is a fallacy that occurs when someone makes a broad or sweeping statement based on a small, unrepresentative sample of data. You may draw a conclusion about a whole group or category based on insufficient evidence. Over the past years, we've been experiencing a growing trend towards regulating online content from social media platforms and selected users. It's for our own good, especially if we want to preserve our democracy and health. However, although advocates for stricter regulations have made sweeping claims about the harmful effects of social media, the supporting evidence remains unclear. In other words, we observe a case of hasty generalization with a touch of confirmation bias. I've always found the particular focus on social media content in the misinformation discussion a bit puzzling, because propaganda works in general, but how come we inevitably assume that the harmful effects of misinformation originates from the average Joes or average Janes? Why don't initiatives to battle misinformation such as fact-checking organizations or media literacy programs hold mainstream media and leading politicians to the same accountability standards? These questions deserve proper attention, even if you agree with the current narrative. Budak and colleagues share their take. Traditional news, and in particular television news, still dominates people's news consumptions, and political elites seek to shape that news coverage. As a result, the mainstream media are key mechanisms for exposing broad audiences to false claims, which often originate with political elites. How often do we get things spelled out like that? Instead, we're often told that individuals should refrain from researching or asking questions or publishing inflammatory or false content. We're also told we can rely on regulatory laws and specific pressure campaigns on big tech to keep us sheltered and safe from harm. Still, few of these voices express condemnation when established news outlets share ill-advised or false information. Also, few suggest engaging people in meaningful discussions to improve the general knowledge about issues that matter. And thinking about it, even fewer acknowledge the existing evidence of causal relationships between economic insecurities and populism extremism and distrust. Apparently, instead of incentivizing participation or enhancing general critical or scientific thinking, we should remain protected from what we don't understand. It's just easier to blame widespread ignorance and regulate or censor uncomfortable content. All of this shows inconsistency in the misinformation narrative, similar to my previous video about the justification of our knowledge. Here we see a practical example of how we mistakenly assume knowledge based on justified true beliefs. If we consider our limited knowledge about social media misinformation, maybe the real issues lie beyond regulating content. Maybe it's time to lower the assertiveness in those arguments, start promoting intellectual self-defense, in the words of Chomsky, and just let people participate in discussions and decision-making. Meaningful engagement. Anyway, this article was an interesting addition to the discussion about misinformation, whether you like it or not. I'll add the link below. What do you think? Did the conclusion surprise you? Did the authors miss anything in their investigation? Let us know in the comments. Talking about annoying algorithms, I hope you liked the content. If you did, remember to like and subscribe to this channel. These are simple actions that help me spread the content and eventually give people what they need. But until next time, peace.